Ladies and gentlemen, in just a moment on the Unconventional Pastor, Bob Greaves asked the question, who could love a God like that? Like what, you ask? Well, that's all he told me, and now I feel just silly. But he's going to answer that question in just a moment.
Well, good evening. My name is Bob Greaves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. And although I don't always say this, let's say in contrast to Greg Bray, a good friend of mine, wonderful fellow, I really like him a lot. Although he begins by telling you that he's an atheist, I am a theist. That is, I'm a person who does believe in God. But I'll tell you what, I really couldn't remain a theist if I was going to continue to believe in the kind of character that God is most commonly believed to be. Oddly enough, I find it odd that the horrible character that God is believed to be by mainstream Christianity is nonetheless a belief, because they actually don't focus on character. Most of it focuses on some metaphysical belief about his essence, metaphysical beliefs about his nature and his abilities, and then they just kind of throw in, without really talking much about it, the meaning of his character. I, for one, believe that God can only really be understood in terms of character, and that's essentially what it is we're dealing with. But if we're going to deal at all, and then a lot of those specifics that are argued about things that are just impossible to, not only just impossible to know, as is the character of God in a sense, but also totally irrelevant to the question, as I understand it. They're only relevant to the question of, am I right or are you right? And so I think that's where a lot of that theology comes from. It comes from the desire to be the people who are in the know, who possess the actual truth, unlike you other guys who just don't. And so it strikes me as being a little bit misguided. Nonetheless, I want to talk a little bit about some of the concepts that we have of God that make me ask, who could love a God like that? Could you love God if he was described in a manner that makes him reckless, that makes him abusive, somebody who lacks the care that he needs, somebody who really just exploits your existence? Could you love a God if we're going to think of him as somebody who takes what he wants from you, no matter what it is that means to you? He just takes it. Oh, we talk about it as well because he knows what's really best for you. So he just takes away. How about a God who is very accusatory, who makes it his job to be able to tell you exactly what your problem is, or the God who is abusive, or backstabbing, the God who's in control of things behind your back, making things happen, and boy, can he show you a thing or two. Now, obviously, your traditional theist doesn't talk about God in quite that way. That's not the way they'd actually put it. I'm just saying that we got to think about some of the things we talk about with God and realize that he isn't that kind of the things we're actually saying. Isn't that how we're putting it? Do we perceive God as somebody who kind of thrives on all of the drama and and seems to love to teach everybody their lessons by putting them through crises and teaching them lessons. It's amazing to me how some people in their concept of God's will do something because they believe this was God's will, and then when it turns into a disaster, instead of saying to themselves, "Did I get that right? Was that really God's will that I do that?" People just don't want to ever second guess what they've attributed to God. And so their next response when they do that which they thought was God's will and it doesn't work out is, well, I wonder what he's trying to teach me here. Instead of thinking, maybe I should be teaching myself to not do that again, and things like that. But they believe in a God that seems to want us to thrive on this drama of crises. I'm telling you, if there's anybody in your life, I don't care whether it's God or your next door neighbor, who wants to interact with you where they thrive on all the drama and crisis that they can put you through, I don't think that's the best kind of a God you want to be dealing with. And I don't see how you could love a God like that. A God who would, for example, threaten you with eternal damnation if you don't accept this gospel. A God who's going to demand that you accept this proof and under the threat of being eternally lost. This is drama and crisis, and in fact, all over something that cannot be demonstrated to be even true. That strikes me as strange. It seems to me that fits in well with traditional theism because it raises the stakes, the alleged stakes, so that those stakes being raised to that dramatic and critical point. When people are living in drama and crisis, they cannot think clearly. They don't have the freedom to be who they are or think for themselves or take responsibility. They're too busy responding to the urgency and the need of the moment. Why do people believe in that kind of a God? I don't get it. I do believe in God, but I certainly don't believe in that kind of a God who thrives on the drama of crisis, the ultimate crisis of eternal damnation. The other crisis that if you're not doing his will, bad things are going to happen to you, and that the things that happen to you are the result of his sovereign plan for you, which strikes me as being it's amazing how people who have selfishly and through greed set up for themselves a far nicer life than the rest of us struggle with. How does that fit into God's sovereign plan? It seems to me that the people who are in power and in control would certainly love us to believe that this is all part of God's sovereign plan. Well, duh, of course they'd like you to believe that because that keeps them in power. It keeps you in your place. So, that kind of a concept of God strikes me as being a concept that could be only perpetuated by the people who are either in spiritual or government or some other form of control and clout. It's really an abusive kind of concept, and it boggles the mind, I think, to try to promote a kind of doctrine about a God who would actually behave that kind of way, or a God who would be that kind of God. Who could love a God like that? I don't think I could. I think one would have to have some sort of a Stockholm syndrome, Or how about this? Could you believe in a God who is going to glorify himself as King of Kings and Lord of Lords by just obliterating every enemy that is in his path? The God who basically outsmarts everybody, wins over everyone else's will, no matter what, through the sheer brute force of his self-glorification. There's something about that kind of God that strikes me as being a bully. I mean, if there is a God, and I do believe there is, and he's the one who can create me, and I'm actually made in his image, and he can create this universe, I would hope that he'd be big enough to figure out that demonstrating his majesty and power by obliterating me is so immature. Think about it. What if what if you had next door neighbors who had a stash of all these automatic weapons, and then they all just run over to your house and shoot everybody in your house just to prove to you, see what I can do? I have the power. I would think that if God has this ability to obliterate all of his enemies, that would be unethical for him to do so. That there's something about that strikes me as being the projection of religious people who, in their belief of God and in a God, are bleeding into that, are seducing themselves in their own belief of God, their own really self-fulfilling wishes. Wouldn't this be wonderful if I'm on God's side and I have his grace, but everybody else, the people who are actually my enemies, if they're the ones who are going to get destroyed and obliterated? Oh, that makes me feel really good. This way I can fantasize delusionally about my own ultimate victory over all the other people I actually have to thereby admit, if I'm going to be honest, I don't care about and I don't love. So I have a hard time. Who could love a God who is going to use this power and glory as a way of just showing us who's boss? What an immature thing. What would you think of a parent who did that? A parent who can demoralize and destroy his children for no other purpose than to show them, I'm the adult here, you're just a kid, and I've got the power. What sort of a sick parent is that? How can you love that kind of a parent? How could you love that kind of a God? I don't see it. It doesn't make sense to me. It strikes me as being, nearly insane. How could you do that? So he shows his great power. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Now, if that is something that God truly inspired being said, then that strikes me as being something that really is a secret that works out like this. Hand it over to me. And you know what I'm going to do with it? Absolutely nothing. In fact, Jesus, when he comes here, that is much the way he said, look, you call me Lord, Lord, and right you are, but I'm not going to lord it over you like the lords of the earth do. That's not the function I have. That's not how I get it done. That's not what I'm all about. And when you in particular, see the fact that Jesus didn't work with the power structures. He criticized the power structures. And he didn't use a power structure to have an influence over people. He used compassion, thoughtfulness, love, kindness, patience, openness. And if there was ever a rough side to Jesus, it was the side he showed to the religious people that he saw as hypocrites who stood between God and other people and go out and proselytize people, making them twice the sons of hell that they are. So I just don't see this. I just don't get it. I don't see how this even fits in with our picture of who Jesus is. How could you love a God like that? A God who's nothing but a big bully, who's going to, history ends, God wins, because he's bigger than you. To hell with that. That just doesn't make sense. It certainly doesn't make sense if that's what we're going to believe, that we could love or worship a God like that. In fact, I guarantee you this, that if you love or worship a God like that, you're doing so only because you're hedging your bets that that's what's going to help you survive. But deep down inside, you can't really respect that kind of abusive bullying. It doesn't work. How can you love a God like that? How could you love a God who wants you to live in fantasy and delusion? How can you love a God who expects you to trump the realities that you do know in favor of a reality that you couldn't possibly know? I can't think of the guy's name, the one actor, George Clooney, I think it was, who said something. he's not trying to be necessarily hostile in that statement, as far as I can tell. But he said, "Look, I don't know if there's a God or whatever." But he says, "One thing I do know is this: I have a life, and I have a life now, and I'm not going to waste what it is I know I have." It seems to me there's a great deal of wisdom in that. But a lot of theism, not my kind of theism, but a lot of theism that's more standard, is asking people to believe in God in such a manner that flies in the face of other realities, asks you to believe in a what I would consider an unjustified, even from the text, view of creation, and reject evolution, which scientifically possesses far more validity than most ignorant Christians even have any clue concerning. And we're supposed to somehow ignore all the facts that we can know, and in ignoring them, come to see. I got some messages coming in. Ignoring what we can know in favor of some nullifying truth that we don't have any ability to know with any kind of certainty. That's gaslighting. Viewer comment: if love is defined as showing affection towards or alliance with, then many obviously find that they have no choice but to love God. It's kind of like, the Stockholm syndrome, or what we call, sometimes people, they begin to empathize with their captors. You'll find sometimes people are kidnapped, learn to even develop affection towards the people who might hold them for a while. Hopefully it's short-lived after they get free, but it is certainly disturbing. And of course, Greg wants to talk to me about this perhaps next week. One of the things I've often said is that I think affection is a very wonderful emotion, and I think that it's a wonderful thing when we have affection for someone, and we even display it and demonstrate it. But I don't see affection and love as being the same thing. In fact, I don't even think of love as an emotion at all. Not saying that you can love and be unemotional. I think that love will incorporate and freely, transparently experience a wide variety of emotions. But love itself is a value system. It's not an emotion. We'll talk about that more later. But in this fantasy and delusion, when we create a theology where this fantasy and this delusion is more important than what is real, it reminds me of something that, of all places, came from a quote that's often attributed to Dr. Bob Jones Sr., where he said, "Don't be so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good." And of course, he was the king of fundamentalists, who strike me as being, of all people, probably the most heavenly minded and the least earthly good of all movements. But I think that was also in a day when there's in a sense, a little more practicality before fundamentalism actually became as deeply entrenched today as it can be in some minds, as it was back in those days. I think it was an idea that it still only reached into them to a shallow level. How can you love a God like that? A God that doesn't want you to live in reality, a God where he wants you to sacrifice that which you possess today for something that's promised in eternity, that you can't even guarantee that promise means anything. Now, I can see how, for the sake of value and for the sake of things that are meaningful, that we can volunteer certain sacrifices. But the call to be in such a delusion, there's something about that kind of God that strikes me as being a little bit off. How could you trust a friend, a neighbor, a spouse, or a boss that expected you to do that? Okay, you're going to be in here working in the post press area, and you're going to be working with this paper cutter. Now, don't worry about getting your arm underneath the cutter. There's no harm that'll come to you. Trust me. I have the power. I'm sorry, if you're going to be working with heavy machinery, you better be careful with all the things that heavy machinery can do. Live in reality, work with reality, take responsibility for the reality that you can know. And if there's anything in our theology that reaches beyond what we can know, it certainly isn't anything that trumps what we know or falsifies what we can know. It could only merely be something that's in addition, that reaches beyond what we can know, but it doesn't trump it. How can you love a God like that? I think of the people who died in the story of Noah's flood. Basically, what? Everybody on earth except 8 people. I think of what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. I think of what happened to Lot's wife. How about Onan that God slew because he spilled his seed on the ground? Or how about the firstborn in Egypt where they all died? Or Korah and his rebellion? Uzzah who touches the ark and is slaughtered. The 42 youths that Dr. Jones often talks about, who, because they were making fun of a bald guy, end up being slaughtered by she-bears sent by God. Well, now that I think about it, I'm not so sure that was so bad. But anyhow, think about Ananias and Sapphira, slain because they lied about what it was they were giving. They did give. They gave considerably, but they didn't give what they said they had given. These kinds of stories are threatening. They're also stories of people whose relationship with God, at least on earth, was short-lived, wasn't it? In other words, we're talking about a trail of dead bodies. How can we love a God like that? What's the threat involved? Isn't that really saying, the religious authorities, you better listen to us. You better do what we say. When we say give, you better give. And when we say give it all, you better give it all. When we say this is the plan, that's the plan, you better not rebel. If you're going to be foolish and immature and make fun of a bald prophet, we're not even going to give you a chance to learn your lesson. We're just going to take you out. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if that incident with the she-bears is something that may have happened, but I certainly don't attribute it to God. It's possible that there was this event where they were making fun of Elijah or some other person, who knows, and where then these bears came out, and much to the horror. This is just a tragedy. It's just a horrible thing, but it could get worked into a story where people offer this explanation for what happened. Which is basically, as far as I'm concerned, it's bearing false witness against God. But nonetheless, how can we love a God who's like this if this is who he really is? That doesn't make sense to me. I don't get it. How can you love a God like that? I really can't. I could shake in my knees, I guess, but I couldn't love. I could give my loyalty, I suppose, because I really don't want to suffer. But is that love? Is that valuing God? Is that really seeing him as valuable and as worth celebrating and is a source of true value? I don't see that. It strikes me as merely someone to be afraid of. It's again that bully. It is the person who is an abuser, an exploiter. It is a person who's a taker. It is a person who's just going to do all sorts of things. It's a God who is in some ways claiming to be a God of love, but he's really an imposter. He's just nothing but a big, selfish, immature man. And if that's what he is, how do we love? How can you love a God like that? I don't get it. I think of other things here. Could you get along with people in your family, your extended family, or your neighborhood, or the business in which you work, if these are people who never really give a damn about any suffering you might be going through? Could you stay in a church if your fellow church members don't have any empathy of any sort for what it is you might be going through and the suffering that you might experience? Um, this lack of empathy, the failing to see what life is experienced like from somebody else's point of view. You know, the traditional theism is of a God who expects you to see things his way, when you don't even have the capacity. Just think about it. That's like an adult expecting a child to see things the adult's way. I'm sorry, but it took an adult all those years in becoming an adult before they could even have the perspective they have. I'm six. I just turned. What did I do? I just turned 62. I just had a birthday. My wife and I both had a birthday this past week. So I'm 62. I'll tell you what, my perspective at 62 is very different than it was in some ways than it was at 52, than it was at 42, than it was at 32. How can I expect a child to be able to make sense of the world in the way that I do and to see it my way? Perhaps I could offer my insight and wisdom, and in hoping that in offering it, that there will come a day when they can see the insight in it. But demanding that they abandon their own way of thinking and adopt just mine, that's asking people to be mindless. That's borderline personality disorder. That's refusing to allow people to go through their own natural learning curve, their own natural development. How can you love a God like that? This is a God that requires you to see everything his way. And although he supposedly understands you, this means you're not allowed to try to even understand yourself. This is circumventing your own being, and it's circumventing a sense of yourself that is the only sense of yourself you can have if you're going to be responsible as a self. So basically, although I'm sure they don't intend this, this is basically a God who doesn't want you to be responsible, except through his point of view, bypassing your own existence as a part of that process of becoming that person. It doesn't make sense to me. How can you love a God like that? This is a God who really doesn't care about your suffering. Doesn't really mean anything to him. It isn't relevant. It's not a part of his plan. It's just too damn bad. That's a strange way of thinking of God. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I think that thinking of God this way is part of where we get this, what I would consider the problem of evil, which I don't really, I don't give that concept too much credit. But it's a strange thing. Does Jesus? Here's another comment. Didn't Jesus command that all of his enemies be brought to him and slaughtered? He did say something like that, or so it appears in the text. When I read certain of the statements that Jesus made, I got to be honest with you. First of all, I don't accept the text as being inerrant. I don't. So I could even accept the possibility that this is just something people put in there to give a little oomph to the story. But I think there's also times when Jesus was speaking sarcastically, actually making fun of religious statements by even saying them. I think a clear example of this is when Jesus says, hey, does your eye cause you to offend? Well, pluck it out. You want to be pure, don't you? You want to, it's better to enter into the kingdom of heaven maimed than to enter into hell whole. You know what I'm telling you? And if your hand offends you, cut it off. Better to enter into life maimed than with a missing hand, than to have your entire body cast into hell. Makes a lot more sense. Jesus is actually, in my opinion, making fun of the absurdity of some of this religious talk. Because if you're going to take this religious talk seriously, you should pluck your eyes out and you should cut your hand off and you should do all these crazy and radical things if that's going to be what, if you're going to be consistent about a lot of these things. So, I'd have to go back to that particular section where Jesus says that, or where it's attributed to him. But yes, that does appear there, and I think that it is that definitely is used to present this. When Jesus said some of these things, I think he's also testing the waters. Where are you at? Does this resonate with you? And why? And when Jesus mocked things, it's I could picture Jesus actually even saying something like this, and then looking at his disciples and going, really? Come on. So I have a hard time attributing that kind of a statement to being anything other than making fun of and mocking the the religious sentiments of the day. And certainly, if Jesus said that, the way that he behaved with his disciples and with other people demonstrated that's far from the spirit he was exercising. He wasn't doing that. In fact, if anybody was doing that, it was the people who decided that that Jesus was the enemy, and they brought him forth and they slaughtered him. That ought to make it clear to you who actually believed that. Was it Jesus or the religious people who had enough of him, got rid of him? But, who can love a God like that? Can you love a God like that? How about this? We find in the biblical text this story that I think with the King James said, it repented God that he had made man upon the earth, during the days of Noah. He was sorry he'd done this. There's other places where the prophets complain about, you've done things that never entered my mind. And God is whining and complaining about all this stuff. Meanwhile, God never accepts any responsibility whatsoever in these things that he's therefore complaining about. If God is really going to complain about these things, and so I don't really see the true God of heaven as complaining about these things. But this is just the way they pictured him. This is more just manipulative talk. This is a God who is very manipulative and a bully and never takes any responsibility for the role he evidently played in these particular outworkings, particularly given the fact of the things that they say he's doing, these other bullying tactics that he has. What other kind of development do you expect people to have? And then you're going to complain about it? How can you love a God like that? It doesn't make sense to me. No remorse, no regrets, no sense of responsibility in a story that talks about a great deal of manipulation, and yet complete dismissal of any personal responsibility inside that same story. Strikes me as odd. I don't get it. I mean, after all, according to the story, who killed all those firstborn? Who opened up the ground so that Achan and his entire camp fell in? Who separated the waters from Moses and then recollapsed them again on the armies of the Egyptians? Who said, is there any way in which in this story God accepts any responsibility for these things as happening, and particularly if he's going to be regretting some of these things as they happened, creating that kind of a scenario and situation that is really not ideal as far as we can tell for people's healthy, mature development? I don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me. How about, a God who possesses what strikes me as being a sense of entitlement and arrogance, where he is this person who demands submission. It doesn't make sense. Why create beings incapable of dealing with the things they need to deal with, and then demand them to submit to the one who can do everything and anything? That strikes me as God playing a game of Sims or something. It doesn't make sense to me that this is the kind of a view of God that would make sense, or that this is the kind of a God that we could love, demanding that kind of submission. In fact, even Greg and I were talking about, that he said, I couldn't worship a God like that. I think that that there's a sense in which the worship of God is really something that is meant to be a substitute for what people traditionally thought of as worship, and that it really has nothing to do with those ideas. It's instead of those ideas. This is one of the reasons why, and I haven't said this in a while, but perhaps it's good to clarify it now. I actually reject the Old Testament as being a document that has a clear revelation of God in it. I don't see it. It's not there. I suppose that there are people who had a sense of who God was and were no doubt involved in the writing of it, but their sense of who God was just commingled with a great deal of immaturity and lack of clarity and a lot of, the stage at which man's development was at in those days. It just seemed like a good idea to put it together in this way. I see Jesus coming into this world as the Messiah who was not their Messiah. I see him as coming as an expression of God, intending to really do away with the cult of Yahweh. So they were looking for a Messiah. I think they were looking for a Messiah. I think Jesus came instead and intended to somehow debunk that entire system. And I think he was quite effective at doing it and was obviously hostile towards that system. And they finally got to the point where they decided they had to get rid of him. And so they did. That's how he ended up being murdered. There's a very different view. Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He was definitely trying to display, even if you don't believe in Jesus or believe that he is a display of God, even if you don't believe that, you can't deny that according to the way that he displayed himself and the way he treated other people, at least according to the story, that there's this difference between what he's like and what Yahweh is like. There's a radical difference going on here. And what's that all about? Makes me wonder. Even Jesus seems to be having this message of, how can you love a God like that? Now, I certainly, I was even talking to Chris Maute the other day about this, do I believe in a personal God? And I said, I do, but not in the sense that most people do. I don't think of God as somebody who's in my back pocket, pulling strings for me in the background, and giving me business tips, and getting involved in orchestrating things in my life, and teaching me lessons and things like that. I don't see that. In fact, to be honest with you, if I were to see things like that, I would expect Christians to be far wiser than they are. If God is somehow doing that, I'd expect them to know a great deal more today than they seem to know, and that they seem to be other people who really don't know an awful lot of things. So it just strikes me as being, how can you have that view of God in light of what the results of that seem to be? They're not working. Doesn't strike me as being real at all. there's something that's not working. So in my sense of God as personal, I'd say that, ever since I was, 5 or 6, that I've always experienced a sense of immaterial presence that I found made me feel that there was something more to the existence of my own dignity, a presence that was to me comforting, but a presence to me that even at that young age I didn't know what to make of it, didn't have any understanding of it, didn't need an understanding of it. It was just good to not be alone. At no time during that period of time from my life, in fact, all the way up until I was 18, I don't recall any time ever thinking God was going to do anything for me, or that it was even his responsibility. I thought it was mine, And it wasn't until I although I was a believer all those years, I didn't even ever really begin to read a Bible until I was around 17. And it was upon reading the Bible, I'm going, oh. And of course, as young and naive and impressionable, I started, really embracing a great deal of it. And I became a fundamentalist. But the truth was that in time, the concepts of a fundamentalist God began to really even contradict my own innate experience of it all. And when I began to see the absurdity of it, I found I can't sustain this. I'm not seeing it as making sense. I'm not seeing it as validated by my experience. Although I see a lot of people saying, well, I've tried God and he has always been there for me. And I see people saying that who have no clue how their own life is showing that if they're going to say he's always been there for them, these are people that needed somebody else to have been there for them many times. And or they don't understand where credit is due or something like that. But it does leave me with that question, It left me with that question. How can I love a God like that? And although I didn't throw the baby out, as it were, with the bathwater, I found I could not love a God like that. I couldn't do it. Bob, did you ever love a God like that? Which is the question. And the truth is, yes, I did. I didn't see that question until I had actually already answered it. I began my beliefism, as it were, without having any kind of theology attached to it at all. And I even went to church every Sunday during the winter. During the summer, my family went up to a boat that we enjoyed on the weekends. But during the fall, the winter, and the early spring, we were always in church every Sunday. It was an Episcopal church. I went there and I listened to the things they were doing, and I never identified any of that as having anything to do with a God that I believed in. And I remember at the age of 12, I was or thereabouts, sitting in church one day, looking up at my dad as he was singing certain of the hymns, and he looked so devoted, and thinking to myself, what's he devoted to? What is it? I don't get it. And I listened to the message that day, and I remember thinking to myself, why would God want anybody to hear that? I just couldn't relate to it. And it was actually at that age that I first developed a desire to become a minister. And I wanted to become one. But at that time, I felt like, well, it would be great to say the kinds of things that would be good for people to hear about God. But I knew that what I was hearing wasn't it. I had no idea what it was, which was why when I reached the age of 17, I was, I may have told you this once before, I was actually looking for a book in my dad's library. We had these bookshelves that had glass doors on them. You lift up the glass doors, and there were all these books on them. And one time I actually found some books behind, some books that were kind of hidden there. And I found, what was Lady Chatterley's Lover or something. This is kind of a porn book, and I read it, and it was like awesome. And I loved it. And so I'm looking for another one to see if I can find it. And what did I find? I found my grandmother's Bible. It was a King James Bible. I think it was, also, the dispensationalist, the Schofield Reference Bible. And I'd never seen a Bible before, and I just started reading it, and I began identifying with it, and it was around that time that I was around 17, and by the time I was 18, I'd read most of it. And I was getting ready to go away to, graduate from high school. I was going to go away to an Episcopalian seminary that was the place where my mentor had gone, and the guy I was talking to a lot about. But he was going through this crisis of faith where he wasn't sure what he believed anymore. And, of course, I'm young and 18 at that time and idealistic. And I was just so offended at the idea that this guy in his 40s could be going through a crisis of faith. And if he could be going through a crisis of faith, my young idealistic 18-year-old self was saying, well, I'm not going to the school he went to if this is the kind of product they produce that by the time you're 40, you don't believe anymore. So I was curious about going someplace else, had no idea where to go. And that's when I heard about this place where they know exactly what they believe. It was called Bob Jones University. I said, okay, that's where I'll go. How's that for a decision-making process? Well, so I did go through that process of fundamentalism. I embraced it. I really gave it a good college try. But I found that several years into it, I began becoming a maverick and going in other directions. And finally, it just fell apart. I mean, I just could not make any coherent sense out of it. It did not strike me as being authentic, real, or proper, or good. And I really had to get rid of it. Anyhow, so there we are. How could you love a God like that is for me a good question. I don't picture it. In fact, if we were to take any of these qualities and personal traits and ascribe them to somebody who was in authority over us, be it a police officer, be it the powers that be, or your boss, or your parents, or anybody, and they possess these kinds of qualities and characters, we couldn't love them when we shouldn't. These are the kind of people you need to avoid. These are the kind of people you need to cut them out of your life. And if this is the kind of a God that you believe in, I think you really need to seriously consider whether or not you need to cut that God out of your life. How can you love a God like that? It doesn't make sense to me. I couldn't do it. I tried, and I really couldn't do it. That's pretty much all I had to say tonight, and I appreciate your attention, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Bob Graves. They call me the Unconventional Pastor, and I'll be talking to you later. Thank you. Take care.